Producers were screaming through his earpiece. "Keep going, Simon. We're live." But Simon Cowell didn't move. His eyes were locked on the old man standing alone under the spotlight. Because what he had just heard would change him forever. The audience sat frozen. Heidi's hand covered her mouth. Howie stared at his desk, unable to look up. And Simon, the man known for his razor-sharp criticism and unshakable composure, felt something crack inside his chest. But to understand what happened in that moment, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when a 72-year-old man named Arthur walked onto the America's Got Talent stage carrying nothing but a photograph and 40 years of silence. Subscribe now and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Arthur Reynolds had never been on a stage before. He had spent his entire life working as a machinist in a small factory in Ohio. 43 years of the same routine. Wake up before dawn, work until his hands ached, come home to a quiet house. He never complained. He never dreamed of anything bigger. Because for Arthur, life wasn't about dreams. It was about duty. His wife, Margaret, had been the dreamer. She was the one who sang while cooking dinner. The one who hummed melodies while folding laundry. The one who always said, "One day, Arthur, you're going to sing for me. Really sing. Not just in the shower." But Arthur never did. He was too shy. Too afraid. Too convinced that his voice didn't matter. And then, 3 years ago, Margaret got sick. Pancreatic cancer? Stage 4. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lived for 8, but those last weeks were brutal. Arthur never left her side. He held her hand through every treatment, every sleepless night, every moment of pain. On her final night, Margaret looked at him with those tired eyes and whispered, "Promise me something." Arthur leaned closer. "Anything. Sing. Just once. For me. Let the world hear what I've always heard." Arthur couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face. And then she was gone. For 3 years, Arthur kept that promise locked inside his chest. He couldn't sing. Every time he tried, he heard her voice, and the grief would swallow him whole. But then one morning, he saw an advertisement for America's Got Talent auditions in his city. And something inside him whispered, "It's time." The day of the audition, Arthur almost didn't go. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for an hour, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the photograph of Margaret he kept on the dashboard. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered to her image. But he thought of her smile, her belief in him. And he stepped out of the truck. The waiting room was filled with young performers. Dancers stretching, singers vocalizing, acrobats practicing flips. Arthur sat in the corner, feeling invisible. A producer approached him. "Sir, are you here for the audition?" Arthur nodded. "My wife made me promise." The producer tilted her head. "Made you promise?" "She passed 3 years ago. She always wanted me to sing. I never did. I was too scared." He paused. "I'm still scared. But a promise is a promise." The producer's eyes softened. She touched his shoulder. "You're going to be okay, Arthur." When his name was called, Arthur walked through the dark corridor toward the stage. His heart pounded so loud he could barely hear his own footsteps. The lights hit him like a wave of heat. The audience was massive, a sea of faces stretching into darkness. And there, behind the judges' table, sat Simon Cowell. Arthur had seen Simon on television. He knew the reputation. The harsh words. The eye rolls. The brutal honesty that had crushed so many dreams. For a moment, Arthur considered turning around. Walking away. Forgetting the whole thing. But then he touched the photograph in his jacket pocket. Margaret's face. Her smile. Her final words. He stepped forward. "Hello there," Simon said, leaning back in his chair. "And what's your name?" "Arthur Reynolds, sir." "Arthur. How old are you?" 72. Simon raised an eyebrow. "And what brings you to America's Got Talent at 72? Arthur's hands trembled. He pulled out the photograph and held it up. "This is my wife, Margaret. She passed 3 years ago. She always believed I could sing. I never did. I was too afraid. But she made me promise, on her last night, that I would sing for her. Just once. So the world could hear what she always heard." The audience fell silent. Howie leaned forward. Heidi pressed her hand to her heart. Simon's expression shifted, the usual smirk fading into something unreadable. "What are you going to sing for us, Arthur?" Simon asked, his voice softer now. "A song she used to hum while cooking dinner." "Unchained Melody." Simon nodded slowly. "Whenever you're ready." Arthur closed his eyes. The music began. And then he opened his mouth, and a sound came out that no one in that theater expected. It wasn't a trained voice. It wasn't perfect. But it was pure. Raw. Filled with decades of love, loss, and longing. "Oh, my love, my darling, I've hungered for your touch." The words floated through the theater like a ghost. Arthur wasn't performing. He was praying. Every note was a message to Margaret, wherever she was. Heidi wiped her eyes. Howie looked away, his jaw tight. The audience sat motionless, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. And Simon Cowell, the man who had heard 10,000 auditions, the man who had seen every trick and every sob story, sat completely still. His hand rested on the desk. His eyes never left Arthur's face. Halfway through the song, something changed. Arthur's voice cracked. Not from weakness, but from emotion. He stopped singing. The music continued, but Arthur just stood there, clutching the photograph, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. The producers whispered frantically into Simon's earpiece. "Keep the show moving. We're losing time." But Simon reached up and pulled out the earpiece. He set it on the table. And then he did something no one had ever seen him do. He stood up. The audience gasped. Howie and Heidi exchanged confused glances. The cameras scrambled to follow Simon as he walked around the judges' table and approached the stage. Arthur looked up, startled. "I'm sorry. I couldn't finish. I'm sorry." Simon climbed the steps to the stage. He stood in front of Arthur, close enough to see the tears still falling. Close enough to see the photograph trembling in Arthur's hands. "Arthur," Simon said quietly, his voice barely picked up by the microphones. "Can I see the photograph?" Arthur hesitated, then handed it over. Simon looked at Margaret's face. A woman he had never met. A woman who had believed in a man too afraid to believe in himself. A woman whose final wish had brought this moment into existence. Simon handed the photograph back. And then he did something that shocked everyone in the theater, everyone watching at home, and perhaps even himself. He put his hand on Arthur's shoulder and said, "You didn't fail her, Arthur. You just kept her waiting. But she heard you tonight. I promise you she heard you." Arthur broke down. His body shook with sobs. And Simon Cowell, the harshest judge in television history, stood there and held him. The audience erupted. Not in applause but in tears. Strangers hugged each other. A woman in the front row sobbed into her husband's shoulder. Howie stood up, wiping his face. Heidi couldn't even speak. For a full minute, no one said anything. The cameras kept rolling. The producers stopped talking. The entire theater existed in a single, sacred moment. Finally, Simon stepped back. He looked at Arthur, then at the audience, then back at Arthur. "I've been doing this for over 20 years, Simon said, his voice rough. "I've heard voices that could shatter glass. I've seen talent that defied logic. But I have never, in my entire career, felt what I just felt." He paused. The theater held its breath. "Arthur, you came here thinking you weren't good enough. You came here carrying 40 years of regret. But what you just did wasn't about being good enough. It was about being brave enough. And that, Arthur, is something I can't teach. Something I can't judge. Something I can only honor." Simon turned toward the golden buzzer. The audience began to murmur. Arthur's eyes widened. Margaret wanted the world to hear you, Simon said. So let's make sure they do. He slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. Gold confetti exploded from the ceiling. The audience leaped to their feet, screaming, crying, applauding. Arthur stood frozen, covered in golden rain, clutching his wife's photograph to his chest. Simon walked back to Arthur and extended his hand. Arthur took it. And in that handshake, something passed between them. Not words. Something deeper. Share this story and subscribe, so moments like this will never be forgotten. Weeks later, in an interview, Simon was asked about Arthur's audition. For a long moment, he didn't answer. He just stared at the floor. You know, Simon finally said, I've spent my career looking for stars. People who could sell records, fill stadiums, win ratings. But Arthur taught me something I had forgotten. He paused. The most powerful voice in the world isn't the most talented one. It's the most honest one. The interviewer pressed further. Did that moment change you? Simon smiled, but it wasn't his usual smirk. It was something softer. Something real. I called my father that night, Simon admitted. We hadn't spoken properly in years. I told him things I should have said a long time ago. Arthur reminded me that we don't always get a later. Sometimes the only moment we have is now. Arthur Reynolds never won America's Got Talent. He was eliminated in the semi-finals. But he didn't care. He had kept his promise. Margaret had heard him. And that was enough. Today, Arthur volunteers at a local hospice, singing to patients in their final days. He brings his photograph of Margaret with him everywhere. And sometimes, when the room is quiet and the light is soft, he swears he can hear her humming along. As for Simon Cowell, colleagues say he's different now. A little less sharp. A little more patient. A little more willing to see the person behind the performance. And every year, on the anniversary of Arthur's audition, Simon posts a simple message on social media. No hashtags. No promotions. Just a photograph of an old man holding a picture of his wife, standing alone on a stage, covered in gold. The caption is always the same. For Margaret. For Arthur. For everyone brave enough to keep a promise. Because sometimes, the greatest performances aren't about perfection. They're about truth. And truth, when spoken from the heart, can change everything. Even Simon Cowell. But the story doesn't end there. What happened behind the scenes that night reveals even more about the transformation that took place. After the cameras stopped rolling, Simon didn't leave immediately. He stayed backstage, sitting alone in a quiet corner, while the crew packed up equipment around him. A producer approached him, clipboard in hand, ready to discuss the next day's schedule. Simon waved her away without a word. For nearly an hour he sat there. Thinking. Processing. Remembering. He thought about his own father, Eric Cowell, who had passed away years earlier. He remembered all the conversations they never had. All the words left unspoken. All the moments he had been too busy, too focused on his career, to simply sit and listen. Arthur's audition had torn open something Simon had buried deep. The realization that time is not infinite. That the people we love won't wait forever. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not to perform, but to be vulnerable. The next morning, Simon arrived at the studio earlier than usual. The staff noticed something different about him. He smiled more. He listened longer. When a young contestant stumbled during rehearsal, instead of his usual cutting remark, Simon walked over and said, "Take your time. We're not going anywhere." The crew exchanged glances. This wasn't the Simon they knew. During a break, Simon pulled aside one of the younger judges, a newcomer still learning the ropes of live television. "Can I give you some advice?" Simon asked. The young judge nodded nervously. "Don't just listen to their voices," Simon said. "Listen to their stories. Everyone who walks onto that stage is carrying something. A dream. A fear. A promise they made to someone. If you only hear the notes, you'll miss everything that matters. The young judge didn't know what to say. Simon just patted him on the shoulder and walked away. Months after the season ended, Arthur received a letter. It arrived in a simple white envelope, no return address, just his name handwritten on the front. Inside was a single page. Dear Arthur, it read. I've judged thousands of performances, but I've only been changed by a few. Yours was one of them. Thank you for reminding me why I started doing this in the first place. It was never about finding perfection. It was about finding truth. You found it. And you helped me find it again. With respect, Simon. Arthur framed the letter. It now hangs next to Margaret's photograph in his living room. Every night before bed, Arthur looks at both. The woman who believed in him, and the words from a man who finally understood what belief really means. Some people chase fame their entire lives and never find it. Others, like Arthur, find something far more valuable. Connection. Legacy. The knowledge that one honest moment can echo through time and touch lives in ways we never imagined. Simon Cowell has said in interviews that he doesn't remember most auditions. They blur together after so many years. But Arthur Reynolds? That name is etched into his memory. Some people sing songs, Simon once said. Arthur sang a promise. And that's something you don't forget. Ever. The America's Got Talent stage has seen fire breathers, acrobats, opera singers, and magicians. It has witnessed standing ovations and crushing rejections. But perhaps no moment captured the true spirit of the show better than the night an old man from Ohio stood under the lights, held a photograph of his late wife, and reminded the world that the most powerful talent of all is the courage to be seen. Not as a performer, but as a human being. And that is a lesson worth remembering.